Okay. Well, I do have. We have to always mute the YouTube video. I think I already have that muted. We are live. It's the first episode we're going to do of Orthodoxy versus Everyone. It's an expansion of our typical Orthodox Apologetics sort of show, because we're just going to address anything and everything that people ask. It's not going to be it's not going to be limited to apologetics versus Rome or Protestantism, etc. We're just going to try to answer as well as we can the Orthodox position on just about anything you throw at us. So, so far, because it's our first episode, we don't expect too much in terms of questions. But we today was interesting. Father Enoch, you noticed a very interesting thread, and you've been commenting on it on the War Zone, and I think it's kind of relevant if you're going to do a show called Orthodoxy versus Everyone.
Yeah, someone posted. John Reeves posted saying. Someone posted a quote, like a picture quote they shared from some group, and it says, "Outside the church, you can find everything except salvation," St. Augustine. And he said, "Please explain." And now the quote is actually from an anti-Donatist sermon of St. Augustine. And the sermon was, it's called the Sermo ad Caesariensis Ecclesia Plebum, or a sermon at, I guess, Caesarea, the church of Caesarea, to the church of the people of Caesarea. And the full quote is, "No one can find salvation except in the Catholic Church. Outside the Catholic Church, one has everything except salvation. One can have honor, one can have sacraments, one can sing Alleluia, one can answer Amen, one can have faith in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and preach it too, but never can one find salvation except in the Catholic Church." So, and the question is, so doesn't that seem really harsh? And the answer is yes. I mean, yes and no.
Well, I mean, you have to realize, when we say yes, it seems really harsh, because if you're looking at it from the perspective of, all those poor people. But as we pointed out in that last apologetics episode, when somebody was talking about the success of the gospel, and that Christians have traditionally been a minority within the world, we tend towards seeing things as what do you call it? We look at Christian history from a kind of Christian lens, not realizing that most of the world wasn't Christian. So it was never going to be a religion for everyone. It was never going to be, bigger than that in that sense. So,
well, there's a more immediate concern. You see, this kind of wasn't that big of a question, like, let's say, the first 1,000 years of Christian history for most people who called themselves Christians.
I'd say it wasn't a question for the first 1,600 years of Christianity.
My point, yeah, exactly. Well, my point is that if you're living in an area in which everybody, let's say, the first 1,000 years, let's just confine us for that just for that sake of argument there. From Ireland to Iraq, you're basically, everybody's Orthodox. Well, I mean, you have Monophysites and Nestorians, but Orthodoxy is still the big thing, So, if you're living in Ireland or you're living in Greece and the priest says there's no salvation outside the church, that's going to be a given. You're not going to really be meeting a lot of heretical neighbors, schismatic neighbors, because the imperial, if like you're living in Greece or England or something like that in the year 1000, and if you're like a schismatic, then you're not going to be a schismatic for very long, because the government's going to compel you to join the official Orthodox Church. And if you're a heretic, you're not. It's the same thing. I mean, in England, it might be a little bit different because you had a lot of pagan Danes people met, but they converted pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So, and because people took this seriously, priests and missionaries and monks were like, well, there's no salvation outside the church. Christ said, "No one comes to the Father but by me," John 14:6. So they were going out and converting people. And they didn't think too much about what if scenarios. They were like, well, this is a warning, not just to those inside the church, but also a missionary warning to a certain extent too. So if you're afraid of what happens to people who die outside of the church, you need to go convert people to be in the church.
Right.
So I think what also how people think is they think, well, what about the kind of the poor old Mongolian woman in like 1850 or something like that who wanted to find what the true faith was, but she never could, and then she dies. Why does God desire to send her to hell? Or now, how would we answer that, Father?
Well, in the first place, again, I'm not, when we're talking about people who have never been touched by the gospel, I tend to think that they're going to be treated in much the same way as people were before there was a gospel. This is, again, this is hypothesizing on my part. I simply don't know. When you're talking about, people who have been ultimately unconfronted by the gospel, I think that's more in the hands of God. But then again, I've heard stories of people, even now there's been stories about in the Middle East, suddenly people who had no experience of Christianity began dreaming of Jesus and became some sort of Christian, and some of them ended up losing their lives for it. So I don't know in that sense how God works on that. I know how he works within the church. And so the point is, the point is when somebody puts that up as a question, it's a false dichotomy. If I can't reach out to that person, I don't know what happens to them, and the truth is, they don't know what happens to them either. So that's really up to God.
Yeah. Now we should make a more exclusive point to Saint Cyprian and his I think Epistle 51, and then he wrote the work concerning the unity of the church. He makes a point that, and this is going to sound also harsh, that when he was confronted with people who were like heretics and schismatics in his age, and they existed, St. Cyprian was very blunt. He said that, even people who were like the Novatian heretics, who were schismatics initially, but kind of became heretics, kind of the various Gnostic groups that believed they were Christians, his view was that they did not have salvation, even if they died in a martyric death.
Right.
Because they were outside the bond of unity of love. And this kind of goes back to St. Augustine's thing. Even if somebody theoretically had all the same teachings, St. Augustine says, even if you've had everything, but you were not part of the church, you're not really going to have true salvation. So we have to balance it by saying, yes, there are some cases in which how could God bring some people into the church before they died in some mysterious way, by his means alone, as opposed to, we're dealing with people who are heretical schismatics that are confronted with the church.
Yeah, and
that's a little bit different than the unknown pagan,
Well, yeah, and when we're talking about like the unknowing pagan, that's one thing. But one thing to also remember, and as horrible as this sounds, is that many people have been touched by the gospel in terms of historic relations. That said, they are not Christians, or they've gone far from Christianity. You take, Judaism, or you take Islam. Or you take Pentecostalism. Okay, maybe Pentecostalism was a poor example, but the point is that these people have, in some way, shape, or form, they've kind of rejected the gospel in some way, and so you have to redouble your efforts on that, because you can't simply say, well, you can't simply come to an agreement. There's no agreement on that, so you have to address it. And it's harsh, but that's the reality.
Well, let's go to the point of the Muslims. For example, suppose somebody bought 1 million Arabic Bibles, and they somehow managed to mail them out to 1 million households in Saudi Arabia, where people had no knowledge of Christianity other than they knew about Christians existed. They didn't know anything else. And these people, and let's say of this 1 million households, you had 1 million people, and at least one person in the household read these Bibles. And some of them come to understand that Christ is the Son of God, believe in the Trinity. Maybe they don't have a perfect understanding. No one can, but maybe they have some sort of understanding. They think, well, this is the truth. Islam is false, and they're arrested, and they refuse to renounce it, and they're executed. Now, would they be true martyrs? Now, the reason I bring that up is because there was a martyr in the early church in the 3rd century, and I cannot remember his name. There are some people who probably do, and he was a pagan actor.
Oh, the clown, I think it was.
Well, part who?
He was like a comedian.
Yeah, and what happened was they were enacting this scene where there's like one guy playing a bishop, another guy playing a catechumen, and that one guy playing the bishop is explaining, do you believe in Jesus, God the Father Almighty, the Apostles' Creed questions before baptism and such. And as he's being mock baptized and thrice immersed with all these questions in the fake catechumenate, he actually comes to faith. He actually says this is true. He doesn't say anything throughout the play, but he comes to belief. And after he's baptized, he's like converted in his soul and in his mind. And he then begins to say, this is the truth. We should not mock it. And people begin to think, oh, it's still part of the show. But then they begin to realize, no, this guy is serious.
That would be Saint Genesius of Rome.
Yes, and he's taken and he's tortured and he's executed.
Yeah.
My point is that but he's regarded as a martyr in the church, even though he was never had no connection to the church in any real sense, so that we could see. How did he become a martyr? Well, because even though they were reading these questions out and reading these kind of, taking, because they probably had access to church books they had seized, and the Roman authorities gave them to the comedians to make fun of, But in the process of reading the church books, he actually was converted and believed, and he's considered a martyr. So isn't the Bible a church book, I guess, is this question in the hypothetical Muslim case. So somebody in Saudi Arabia, a Bedouin, reads the New Testament, comes to believe Christ is the Son of God, comes to believe basically the same things as St. Dionysius, then he's taken and he's tortured because he refuses to renounce and executed. I would think he would be a true martyr because the New Testament is an Orthodox book. It's the book of the church. So I'm just saying I think some people, but I mean, that would be a little bit more nuanced if like the Baptist came or something like that. I understand, but you can theoretically have cases like that. They may be very extraneous, but that can happen.
And so I think that goes to the deeper question of how God handles those who have no connection to the church. Because
God vouchsafed some sort of connection
to
the church to that man.
Right.
I don't know what only he can do.
And that was my point. That God can reach them directly even without our help, so it's not our concern.
Yes, and my only point was that what happened to St. Dionysius of Rome did not violate the principle of extra ecclesiam nulla salus. There was no salvation outside the church, because he was given the grace of being in the church, even though they didn't have a priest or even a layman there to do a baptism for him in an emergency. God gave him that grace, and he died. There was martyrdom in his blood at the very least.
Yeah.
And also, this kind of goes to, that principle is well established, that God can give grace to somebody outside of physical waters of baptism. For example, we do believe theoretically that happened with catechumens in some cases and such. For example, the Emperor Valentinian, St. Ambrose distinctly says in his sermon on Emperor Valentinian that because the emperor was going to be baptized and he was murdered on his way, that God had given him the grace that he could not find in the waters. How does God do that for the case of, let's say, the case of St. Dionysius, or the hypothetical, or there could actually be Muslims that have read the Bible and have said, I believe Christ is the Son of God, and they renounce Islam. Their family gets up and their family kills them within like 10 minutes. I have no doubt that has happened a good deal. I think, at least my opinion was, God would have a great deal of mercy and would make them part of the church. And of the Orthodox Church in some way, he knows, because they never had a chance to really, reject the truth.
Well, in that sense, the fact that, I'm sure that happens in a number of cases, but the very fact that Protestants are reaching out to these people first, that's a failure on our part, and it is something we need to correct.
And it's also a failure because, considering the fact that you have people who claim to be Orthodox in the Middle East, and I know this is very controversial to say this, but how many missionaries are they sending into converting Muslims around them? Well, there's unfortunately been an attitude for the past 80 years in the Middle East that you don't want to try to convert Muslims because it's going to disrupt the society or something like that.
I think it's more that there's, people are just focused on survival.
That's true, and I understand
but
that.
At the same time,
what if the early martyrs had just said, we're focused on just surviving, not converting?
Exactly the point is that, if you take the case of Eusebius of Cordoba, that was precisely the society that he was inhabiting, and unfortunately, it also puts to the lie the historical claim that the Islamic Spain was just a peaceful place that was great for everyone.
You're talking about the Cordoban martyrs, like St. Evlogius of Cordoba?
Evlogius of Cordoba, excuse me. And the point is, it was, he was basically saying that this is not the way Christians are supposed to live. We're supposed to live in freedom, and it's better to be a martyr than to compromise. And so the fact that that's happening in the Middle East is unsurprising. It has been happening for, it took 150 years, no longer. It took a couple of hundred years for Spain to get itself back in order. And so the point is, and the Middle East has been hard on Christian society. It's not just, as one person I know put it, in the Middle East, you have the Jews versus the Muslims, and the Christians get squeezed in the middle. And I imagine that that's been the case for a very long time. So I don't, it's a tough question, because if you're the guy in the middle and everyone else is basically trying to squeeze you out, or use you as an excuse for your resources not being sufficient, it's problematic. So it's a deeper question, I think, that we have to ask, and why we're not doing. I mean, I can understand why they're not sending out missionaries, but the compromise.
Well, what my point, and this is the takeoff on what you said about the Protestants, and the Protestants don't have the true gospel, obviously.
No,
that they're sending missionaries to Islamic countries, and they're dying. But where are the Orthodox missionaries going to Muslim countries to spread the true gospel?
Yeah, and
so that's basically my point. Is that's an embarrassment that the true church is being outdone in zeal by heretics.
It's not even outdone in zeal. Remember that the American Protestant missionaries have the ability to act as foreigners, whereas they're, in a sense, they're given more lenient treatment under the law. So I hate to say it, but these governments are like, well, we can't mess with them because they're Americans. Something could happen, and then we'd have to deal with the U.S. State Department. But the point is, if you're a local and your family's been there for thousands.
So you're saying, if hypothetically, if I was to go to like a missionary into Saudi Arabia,
Saudi Arabia is a unique case, because that place has a ban on any kind of proselytism, no matter who you are. But because you're an American, you'd probably get out alive.
Okay. Well, I mean, then there should be more Orthodox missionaries American Orthodox missionaries going to Saudi Arabia, then, right?
Yes, I don't know how many would want to volunteer, and so
you got to learn Arabic. So
okay, now Matthew Thompson asks us: was Saint John Chrysostom, an anti-Semite?
Well, it depends on how you define anti-Semite.
Yeah,
Okay, so if you read his sermons against the Jews, some people say they should be translated against the Judaizers. They can be translated as either, because he says a lot of things against both groups.
I've been more of a fan of against the Judaizers, because he's really talking about their influence on Christianity.
Yeah, that's true. But because the sermons are directed against people who are going to the synagogue and claiming to be Christians, but he does go in for the Jews a lot too. So
I'm not saying he doesn't, but it's the circumstance itself is so unique that doesn't happen today.
Yeah, but let me make a point. He would, if by anti-Semitism did he despise rabbinic Judaism, Phariseeism? Yes, that. If that's how you define anti-Semite, but did he have a ethno-racial understanding that made him hate the Jews? I don't think so.
I don't think the Jews themselves had an understanding like that.
Because technically the Jews were still trying to convert people to actual Judaism. That was part of the problem. So it depends on how you define anti-Semite. That's just going to be if you define anti-Semite in the sense of like late 19th century, 20th century racial science of
pseudoscience.
Yeah, pseudoscience that the Jew has some sort of genetic predisposition to being evil. No, but St. John Chrysostom would have said that they're the synagogue of Satan, and that the devil does have a hold over them, and he is using them, and that their only way for them to escape that is by true repentance. And though the majority of them did not want to do that, occasionally you would have a Jewish person convert. For example, Saint Epiphanius of Salamon. Now, you did have a lot of Jews actually that converted in the early centuries.
Like the first ones.
Exactly. And you did Saint Epiphanius of Salamos, for example, was one of the great fathers who wrote the Panarion and other works against heretics. You have the Count of Tiberius, whose name I cannot remember, who was like a former assistant to the Jewish head of the Sanhedrin. So that could happen.
And it continued. You have St. Julian of Toledo in the 7th century.
Oh, no, that's true. Well, I think his grandparents had been originally Jews.
I thought it was his parents.
Okay, it may have been his parents. But my point is that it depends on how you define anti-Semite. The word anti-Semite is to be honest, it's not a very useful word, because if I write a book criticizing the Talmud and just criticizing rabbinic Judaism and et cetera, and saying this is a horrible religion and evil and things like that, what's going to happen in the media? The Southern Poverty Law Center will basically say, "Oh, Father Enoch, this notorious anti-Semite."
But one thing that, and I've I addressed this before. This is where it gets tricky. Is that you always describe Judaism in a monolith. And I'm going to give a good example of this. I was reading about very recently. There was a rabbi who had spotted in the Satmar community that he had discovered that there was a history of pederasty, that many of the rabbis were basically molesting young boys. But he was so horrified by this, and he began, trying to, organize things like getting the cops after some of these people, that eventually the community began hitting him with death threats. And so the point is not because of the fact that, that they were defending pederasty, but because of the fact that these rabbis were basically saying, oh, this guy's a liar, and, so on and so forth.
Well, okay, no, my point is that, we're getting really far off topic here, but it's kind of related. But the question is, no, St. John Chrysostom was not an anti-Semite, and he was at best what you might call religious, quote unquote, anti-Semitism. This is really anti-Judaism.
Yeah,
that's because St. John Chrysostom was not going to say the Talmud or Rabbinism or the oral law were good. I mean, St. John Chrysostom explicitly says the synagogue is a temple of Satan. He didn't say to go shoot up. He didn't say to go attack a synagogue. Let me be frank, okay? But he said that synagogue within the synagogues, there was demons and things like that.
I think one of the biggest problems that we have in today in dealing with the question of relations between Christians and Jews is that we do not separate Judaism from the Jewish people as often because there was no concept of the Jewish people much earlier in time. There was Judaism as a religion in the first centuries of the church. So what I find here is that if you talk about the historical problems of Judaism, which is one thing you can do, but then you have these movements that are, a lot of them are based in Nazism and other things, where it becomes about naming the Jew. Well, that's a whole different ballgame than what the church was doing. The church was answering why the Jews were wrong, and also why the pagans of various countries were wrong. But, because let's face it, the early missionaries to England did not deal with a cohort of Jews. There were no Jews there, so they mostly dealt with pagans. But the point is, we always have to point out who is wrong. What I'm not a fan of is going into these movements that have no basis in Christianity, that are usually based in pseudoscience, and then saying, well, you know what, they might have been right too. No, they're not. They have nothing to do with the church, and if you have nothing to do with the church, you're not going to be right. Whether you're Jewish, non-Jewish, anti-Jewish, I don't care. It's the church.
Let me make another point that traditionally the Christian response when Christian civil authorities were in power, for example, if you look at the councils of Toledo throughout the 600s, was that there were various strictures placed on Jews and encouragements were made for them to convert.
Yeah.
And now supposedly this created the problem of what called the morosos or the conversos or something like that.
Well, that's much later. That would
yes. But the point was still because you mentioned St. Julian of Toledo, the point was they wanted the society to be an Orthodox Christian society.
Yeah.
And so if the Jews were willing to, the concept was that Jews cannot own Christian slaves. Jews cannot hold civil authority, civil offices.
Can't charge you.
They can't charge interest. If they are willing to be baptized and truly convert, there's much welcome to that. The Seventh Ecumenical Council actually has a canon that states that you must determine whether the Jews are sincere or insincere, because there was a problem actually of people insincerely converting just to get civil advantages. And then because there was this point in which Byzantine rulers and Spanish rulers were basically say, well, great, Jews are converting. We're going to give you like a noble title and give you land, because they were trying to find ways of encouraging people.
They kept that up all the way into the 16th century.
In Poland, they actually made you kind of the lowest level of nobility if a Jew became like a Roman Catholic in the 1600s. The problem is that a lot of Jews would do that, but not really, really convert. You know what I mean? They outwardly convert, and then they'd inwardly still cause problems, So that was the old converso problem. But my point was that it was until the 19th century, you don't really have any really racial basis for any of it. It was purely
based upon religion.
Yes, it was based upon it was based upon the fact that this is a false religion, and it's not just Old Testament. So in fact, if you read I cannot remember his name. He wrote a book called the Talmud Unmasked. He wrote a book called the Renaissance Culture.
Who was this? Hoffman or
Michael Hoffman? And he actually brings up some interesting points, because one of the things he points out is that there were actually Jewish people in the post-schism West. I'm just giving you an example. in the early 1500s that converted to Roman Catholicism. That's all they thought was the true church. And I'm not defending Roman Catholicism, but they converted, and they were writing things attacking the Talmud. But you had all these like kind of crypto occultists in the Roman Catholic Church that were like, the Talmud is great, the Zohar and all, and they were like attacking these Jewish converts.
Well, that's also because of the fact that Kabbalism became bigger in that period. And so,
my point is that what happened is when you had a genuine convert, what you find is they ended up attacking Judaism because they realized how bad it was. And anyway, my point was that that's the same thing with Saint Epiphanius. Well, that's what you find with Saint Epiphanius of Salamis.
But that just means that the problem that we have today is very similar to the problem we had back then, because Kabbalism isn't accepted by most of Judaism.
Well, I guess I understand that. My point is that I'm saying, but there's this generic attitude. A lot of things among Jewish culture today is kind of remnant things and recidivist. I don't know how to explain it.
Recidivism is a good way to put it.
Basically kind of a cultural Judaism that still does have, like you have these like Jewish comedians like Larry David and others who are atheists.
Yeah,
but they will horribly mock Christ and do all kinds of terrible things because they think that's funny, and they don't like Christianity.
But I think that's all atheists. I hate to say that. I mean, it's just that the one thing is that at that point, is he doing it because he's Jewish, or is he doing it because he's an
I think it's a combination of both, because if you go to Israel, you see what happens to Jews who become, even if they're non-Orthodox, become some kind of heterodox group. They are discriminated against.
Well, and a lot of that
the question is, why are they discriminated against by a state that is mostly secular?
Well, they're not supposed to be secular, though. They're supposed to be.
But my point is that it's considered, by converting, you're considering to somehow lose your Jewish identity or something like that. It doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Well,
because there was someone pointed out that there was this one rabbi who said, famous British rabbi who said something like, there is really no Jewish culture. It's simply just the Talmud and the teachings of the rabbi. And if we lose that, then we become a nobody and such.
So he's basically arguing that Judaism's a religion, not a people.
His point was that people who are kind of culturally Jewish are on their way gradually to losing anything about what they are.
Well, I know that there was actually...
They may go down and they may have all this. Anyway, I'm saying it's a multivariate, question.
Yeah, I know. I think in Israel, they actually, if I remember correctly, some rabbinic high court basically said Reform Jews are not Jews and therefore have to reconvert to Judaism.
But this, I agree. But the question, I think there's a lot more I can say, and we could probably argue about it. But the question is this: was St. John Chrysostom an anti-Semite? Not in the modern sense.
No.
He would be not in the modern racial sense.
Yeah,
but if he would still be by the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Jewish Defense Alliance or whatever the heck, ADL, he would be considered anti-Semite. But they consider almost anybody an anti-Semite. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
Okay, but since we have no more other questions, we'll go through some other stuff on the war zone, I guess.
Yep. And we'll just we'll keep the war going.
Okay. What do we have on the war room?
Let me see here. Hold on, because we did the Old Believers, so I'm not even going to touch that. I think this is an interesting thing. It's been kind of popular. People have been talking about this new edition of the Rudder, which is, the Pedalion is the canon law book of the par excellence of the church. There are smaller law books and canon books that have existed over the centuries, but the main ones that are held by the Universal Church would be in the Rudder. Maybe you can give, because I know some people had some questions about it. They were asking what's wrong with it. What was wrong with the other Rudder?
Okay, so in the 1940s.
Yeah.
There was, I think, something called the Orthodox Christian Educational Society in Chicago. I'm going off memory here. And they published a translation of St. Nicodemus's Rudder, or Pedalion. St. Nicodemus was a saint in the Holy Mountain. I believe he reposed in the 1790s, around 1800.
Yeah.
And he had basically taken the canons and he put them into kind of Demotic Greek. So they were easy to read for anyone. And he wrote an interpretation. He wrote what's called a concordance, and he wrote several notes on it. And this was so well received in Constantinople that they kind of like gave it official approbation. And it was and I think in the Slavonic world, they had something called the Kamchi Kachanga, Kaninga Kamchanga.
No, it's the Kaniga, the book of the consortium.
Exactly. It's basically the book of the canon too. Yeah. Well, there was a man called Chrysostom Stratman and an associate called Denver Cummings who made a translation of St. Nicodemus's work. And I guess it would have been probably the beginning of the 30s, and they published it in the 40s, I believe.
They were big fans of a guy named Apostolos.
Yeah, they were basically part of a society that was dedicated to promoting Apostolos Macracus, who was technically a condemned heretic. Although they never, although the Synod in Greece never chose to publicly publish the excommunication, and they did allow him to have a church funeral, though he was essentially censured for basically teaching, like, at the very least, erroneous things. There's a lot more to go into about Apostolos McCrackpot. That was what our father Brendan used to call him, Apostolos McCrackpot. But so they published the Rudder in the 40s, and the problem is that Denver Cummings and Chrysostom Stratman added their own commentary into St. Nicodemus's commentary. And this is very noticeable right at the first interpretation on Canon 1 of the Holy Apostles, where out of nowhere it says, this is why we say in English, so-and-so. And when I was first reading that, I was like, wow, St. Nicodemus, did he translate this?
Yeah.
But that doesn't belong there. That a lot of that stuff is added. So people have been taking the Greek text of St. Nicodemus and comparing it to the Denver Cummings and Chrysostom Stratman text and basically removing the commentary. And the other problem is that they also added all these gigantic, like, 20-page articles in some cases of Apostolos Macracus into the Rudder. I mean, you can identify them, but they just out of nowhere you turn a page and there's this 20-page article by Apostolos Macracus on some kind of something about the philosophy, Greek philosophy, and I don't know, something or another. Some of the articles aren't that bad, but some of them are kind of like you're not sure what he's even talking about. And then there's this big introduction to the English Rudder where it talks about Apostolos Macracus being like
the next freedom.
I think they talk about him almost as, I think they, I can't remember from memory. It's like he's like described as the angel, like, the book of Apocalypse. There's the angel who goes through the heaven preaching the everlasting gospel. It says they basically are talking like him. He's like he's this prophesied figure and the great teacher of the Greek nation. And now Saint Nectarius, Saint Nectarius of Aegina, actually I think knew and encountered Macracus, and he kind of said some of the stuff he wrote was all right, but he had a pride issue where he kind of thought he knew better than everybody else, So if someone has a question about Macracus, we go on that. But the point is, they published this edition of the Rudder. It's been kind of popular among Orthodox for the past 60 years, though it's been increasingly difficult to find a copy. You have to pay sometimes $200 to find one online. Various people have tried to get the copyright, so people have been trying to take it and edit it so it's more in line with the original Greek text. Now, it should be noted that you could actually have found all the same canons back in the 1880s in English, because volume 14 of the Post-Nicene Fathers of the Erdmann series has everything that's in the Rudder in it, except the interpretations and commentary of St. Nicodemus from the 1790s. Which are
extremely useful.
Well, the commentary of St. Nicodemus is useful, but my point is that if you look at the Erdmann's one, they actually give Aristinus' commentary. They give Theodore Balsamon in some cases.
Yeah, but then they put in Van Espen.
Yeah, well, you can ignore the later Van Espen and the Roman Catholic ones, but you still have things like the ancient Epitome by Nicholas Hydratius and such. So my point is that back in the 1880s, you could have just taken that and just ignored Van Espen and just looked at the ancient commentators in it and just read the canons, and you would have had still a basic, very, very good understanding of it. So it wasn't like they did this great they did do a good thing in the sense they translated St. Nicodemus' commentary. That's essentially the best thing they could have done.
Yeah.
Hopefully, if only other people could have done it before them.
Well, at least we cleaned it up now, so that's why it's interesting to a lot of people. So ultimately, it's been taken care of. Whoever did that, God bless him.
Yes,
it's nice to have an unruined version of the Rudder in English, even if it's
because Chrysostom Stratman wrote a lot. He hated Overbeck. I mean, maybe we should do a whole program about him one day. But he was a figure of some sort, So, okay. So next question: could you address the issue of Sergianism? What would it take, in the view of the true Orthodox, which would be us, for the MP Corps to reconcile itself with the greater Church and repair the break that it had committed? Sergianism is the teaching, essentially, that you should submit to atheist and God. You should submit and cooperate with atheist and God-hating authorities, supposedly in the name of the betterment of the Church.
Well, I think it even extends to some degree, even to secular authorities in general.
Nah, not the secular. I think it's very specific because technically there was never an accusation against the during the Turkocratia of Sergianism or anything like that. So we don't want to confuse the Turkocratia with what happened under Sergius in the 20s and the 30s during Stalin's period. That's my main point about saying that, because technically the Ottoman Sultan was really interested after money. If you kind of gave him a bunch of money, he kind of left you alone.
But that's exactly my point. He didn't make demands so the church passed money.
Exactly. Sergianism made more demands.
Well, right, but my point is, if the Turks had begun, say, for example, telling people to commemorate the Prophet Muhammad during the liturgy or something,
Yes.
then effectively, if they obeyed the state at that point, they would be falling from the church.
Yes. So that's the issue of Sergianism. And we can go a lot more on Sergianism, but it says, what would it take in the view of the true Orthodox for the imperial court to reconcile itself with the greater church and repair the break committed? Well, first they'd have to have a condemnation, explicit condemnation and anathema against Sergianism.
Well, and just to make one thing clear, the ROCOR, not even putting aside the MP, but the ROCOR actually knows what Sergianism is. And many of the people who define Sergianism were members of the ROCOR. So they know better than anyone else what needs to be done. And so in that sense, they're more culpable than the MP, because the MP can at least have the excuse, well, no one told us. The ROCOR does not.
So to repair it, but I'm saying to repair the breach, they'd have to publicly identify that we know what Sergianism is, we anathematize it, we condemn it, and that would be the first thing they'd have to do. But I really don't see them doing that at this point. There are probably some people in the MP that might be friendly to that, but the problem is there are a lot of people who still consider Patriarch Sergius to be this like great figure, which is really horrible.
Saying stuff like that.
Pardon me?
They're still officially saying stuff like that.
Yeah, he saved the church supposedly.
Yeah, and so that's the first thing that needs to change. And the second thing, from a practical standpoint, that needs to change is a few of these bishops, not nearly as many as 20 years ago, but a few of these bishops are still state agents.
Yeah.
And so, I hate to say it, but one thing that a lot of them are going to have to do is they're going to have to die. I mean, or they're going to have to...
Or retire, or just say, I'm going to a monastery, I'm sorry.
Which is probably not going to happen.
Yes.
So, I think that, it's an interesting question, because now the question would be, because, again, who would they repent to? I mean, the whole point is they'd have to repent, to God first off. But, it's not like they can go to Constantinople at this point and be like, we repent of service.
Well, I think since he's mentioned us true Orthodox, they'd have to go repent to a true Orthodox church. And the problem in Russia is there's something like 7 groups claiming to be the true Orthodox Church of Russia.
Exactly. And which one do you go to?
Yeah.
I think a better policy would be to make peace with all of them and stop stealing their buildings. That would be a good
step. Yeah, that would be a first. Yes. So even maybe condemning Sergianism along with giving Suzdal back all of its buildings.
Yeah.
That might actually giving back the buildings and saying we're sorry all the things we did back in the past.
Yeah,
we're not going to persecute you. That might actually do a lot more than they imagine.
Yeah. And so the point is, and then from there, you really have no idea what could happen. I mean, that could repair things almost instantly. You just don't know. I mean, we're living in a world right now where we're watching Constantinople and Moscow anathematize each other and bring up charges that true Orthodox have been bringing up for the past 70 years, and they're bringing them up in the last 2 weeks like these are brand new things. So the point is, did we expect this a year ago? No, we didn't. So people keep asking us what to do, and the truth of the matter is, you're kind of answering your own questions. If you look at what each side is saying about the other, and you say, okay, well, we're just going to anathematize all of that, congratulations, you've pretty much solved your problem.
Okay, so the next question is, what did true Orthodox think about prehistoric creatures? Well, first off, my opinion, and I know not everybody may agree with this, is that, the Earth is not really that ancient, and it's only, I think, no more than 10,000 years old. I mean, at most. And I think that when we look at a lot of these prehistoric creatures, like the dinosaurs, they weren't living 65, 70 million years ago, but they were living before the flood of Noah.
Well, some of these creatures were documented in ancient texts, or variants of these creatures were documented in ancient texts. Mm-hmm. And the whole point is that, again, and a lot of things that we read, they kind of fantasticize what these alleged prehistoric creatures were like. And what I mean by that is that a lot of it is based not upon actual data, but it's based upon artist renderings. So the point is,
like, for example, there's this new movement to say that the Tyrannosaurus Rex actually had feathers.
Yeah.
And so, and that, in other words, he doesn't look like the Jurassic Park creature. He looks like some kind of weird emu, I guess, or something like that, Well, so how much do they really know? They're finding bones, and and every now and again they might find some kind of weird fossilized organ or fossilized skin remnants, and they're having to extrapolate how the creatures behaved based upon the fact that they had teeth, maybe they were a predator. How did they sound? A lot of this is immense guesswork to begin with. So
now, I want to also bring something up here, because you mentioned Tyrannosaurus Rex, and that's a great example, because people tend to fantasize about what things like Tyrannosaurus Rex were, and it's not their fault. If you look in children's books about dinosaurs, they make these things sound like they're these massive creatures that roamed the earth, and they were so big that humans could never possibly be near them. A Tyrannosaurus Rex, based on its skeleton size, averaged about basically 12 foot high, and their tails could go up to 40 feet in length. To give that perspective,
wait a minute, they were 40 feet in length from the tip of their nose to the end of their tail, correct?
Yeah. Now, to give you some perspective, an American alligator, the largest American alligator that was ever recorded, measured 19.2 feet, or about half the size of a Tyrannosaurus. What this basically means is when you're dealing with a Tyrannosaurus, you're talking about something that's about twice the size of an alligator.
Okay, man. Now, according to the internet, the Tyrannosaurus could be anywhere from 15 to 20 feet tall.
12. I read 12 to 20 feet tall, but the point is, 12 is still not the whole point. Is
but it's like an alligator standing up. If it had two legs, I guess. Yeah.
Well, alligators have four, and so the Tyrannosaurus had two small legs and two big ones. The point I'm trying to make is that these are not fantastical creatures. If you take any,
I don't know. I mean, if you were confronted by one, it probably would be kind of scary.
Well, if it's 12 feet high, that means it's like as big as the second story of my house. So ultimately, granted, it would have a huge head. I'm not denying that. But on the other hand, it would have very small front feet, which means that it would be very easy to attack from the underbelly. And also, the idea is that it was this fast-moving creature. People wrestle alligators all the time. It's not like suddenly we go from alligator to like Barry Allen speed. The thing is still going to be a big lizard.
Well, and remember also, even the kind of Darwinian evolutionists admit that humans hunted the woolly mammoth, the largest kind of elephant creature that was bigger than that was 20 feet. That was basically the size of the Tyrannosaurus Rex to extinction, supposedly. All right.
The woolly mammoth was bigger. I mean, an elephant is way bigger than an alligator.
I mean, the woolly mammoth is basically the size of the Tyrannosaurus Rex, right?
Well, let me see. Okay, it reached shoulder heights between 8.9 to 12 feet. Okay, so it was about as tall as a Tyrannosaurus Rex, but it weighed it weighed 6.6 tons. I mean, it weighed the width of a truck.
A woolly mammoth, right?
Yeah, so I mean, the thing had huge tusks. So I imagine face to face, I would think that a woolly mammoth has at least a decent chance, unless it's really slow, against a Tyrannosaurus Rex.
So my point is that if humans can basically hunt in groups and kill woolly mammoths, and we apparently did do that thousands of years ago, I have no doubt, then killing a tribe of humans with spears, planning out an attack on a Tyrannosaurus Rex, they could kill a Tyrannosaurus Rex. So the concept that we would have been hunted to extinction by the Tyrannosaurus Rex, I don't buy.
Yeah, and so and plus on top
humans are smart. God gave us this ability, the thinking.
Yeah,
so you can outthink of animal. I mean, ancient humans fought dire bears, which are 12 or 13 feet. They were like twice the size of a grizzly bear. I mean, grizzly bears are humongous creatures that can run 30 or 40 miles an hour at a top speed for brief moments. Dire bears were twice the size.
Well,
humans still.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm just saying is that the concept that humans couldn't have lived at the same time as the supposedly prehistoric creatures because we were going to hunt. I don't buy that. I mean, the groups of humans would have basically killed them, and they would have learned to stay away from humans.
Well,
like a lot of other
an
creatures
interesting
do.
thing. Looking at the wiki on the Tyrannosaurus, it talks about, over half of the known Tyrannosaurus rex specimens appear to have died within 6 years of reaching sexual maturity, a pattern which is seen in other Tyrannosaurs and large, long-lived birds and mammals today. These species are characterized by high infant mortality rates, followed by relatively low mortality among juveniles. So effectively, Tyrannosaurus had tasty eggs. The point is that if they did, I'm not sure if they live birthed or they had eggs. I'm going to check that really quickly.
I think they had eggs. I think they found eggs, actually.
Well, and that's what I'm curious about, but I'm going to, just to be sure. But the point is, obviously, young Tyrannosaurs could be easily, they had eggs. And so the point is, probably people stole, the eggs, and other, predatory creatures stole their eggs. And, the idea of this Jurassic Park Tyrannosaurus that is like terrorizing all these people, it was probably more scared of people than we let on.
Well, it's also like a wolf. For example, a wolf is not going to attack unless it's really, really driven to one or two people. If someone has a weapon,
it's kind of a mammal. It's not, it thinks a lot differently than your average lizard. I mean, it's much easier to scare.
Well, it's more. Tyrannosaurus Rex was not a lizard; they would have been a reptile, which is they would have been different.
Well, lizard is a reptile.
Well, but my point is nevertheless is that do we see a lot of, alligators and crocodiles will attack humans, but are they really going into villages and killing dozens of people before one person can manage to kill them? That doesn't really happen a whole lot, I think.
No, they probably. They might have had very good leather. You never know what was the real selling point to taking one down.
And the other point is that after the fall of man, it affected all of creation. So weather patterns would have changed. A number of things would have happened, and then the flood. So, I just don't see it as a big.
A lot of creationists argue that basically these creatures died in the flood because of the inconsistency of where they are in the fossil record.
Yes.
So I hope that helps to some degree. I don't, I don't think that, there's a set history book that the true Orthodox follow about we don't believe in prehistoric creatures, in the sense that we don't believe in prehistory unless you count the 7-day creation, and we don't know how that worked. But the point is, what we do know is that there were probably not dinosaurs roaming around for, billions of years doing nothing, and then just dying. So, that's the way I see it anyway.
Yep, I agree.
So I hope that helps. Matthew Thompson asked, I heard in the early church they held open group confessions in the church. Why was this practice discontinued, and why would this type of confession be valid in the Orthodox Church today? I think it answers itself. The reason why people did not like open confessions is because they were open confessions, and that interestingly is why the I believe it's Celtic practice of private confession originally began to become more popular, simply because it was an embarrassment, which is why people held off on their confessions, often to their deaths. Well, not to their deaths, but their almost deaths.
Well, remember, there was a figure in each. There was oftentimes a figure in a diocese called an ex-homologist or something like that, and their purpose they were appointed to give penances. Like they used to have something called the group called the penitents.
The penitentes, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And confession was oftentimes used when you committed what was considered the deadly sins, since they could keep a man out of the kingdom of heaven.
Right.
And you had to go before the presbyter, and you had to basically admit, and this was done to some extent, at least early on, in a community context.
Right. It was in front of the community.
Exactly. So the presbyter or the bishop or the presbyter appointed would give you a penance. And they did not give you absolution then. They actually waited till your penance was finished. And then at the end of that penance, you had made atonement, in essence. Because the concept is, if you're doing open confession, it's actually much more different, because you're offending not only God, you're transgressing and committing a sin before God privately, but you're affecting the whole community in the fact that you can, because the concept was that if you're part of the body of Christ, what you do has an effect, even if you don't know it, on everyone else. All right? So if you're confessing it publicly, the whole community can be scandalized. So the penances were actually, all these harsh penances come from that period of the second and third century, 40 days on bread and water and things like that. There was really no way to, you might say, economize penances when you were making open confessions about stealing things, sexual sins, all these other things. It was just scandalous. So they had to make an atonement not only before God, but before the community. That was often where you had much harsher penances. And you finish your penance, and then they would give you absolution. And oftentimes, this would be done on Holy Thursday. Now, over time, and you get into the 4th century and the early 5th century, because of the influence of the monastics, the early monastic movement, the monastics had the practice of going to their abba, the abbot, you might, for lack of a better word, or the head of the elder of the monastics. And even if he wasn't a monastic, they would confess all the things, their thoughts and their sins to him. Now, that wasn't considered, you might call it, that wasn't necessarily considered a sacramental confession, but it was still considered you were, unloading yourself to him. And then you had to go to the bishop or the presbyter who was appointed in that community to receive, the mystery. Yeah. Exactly. And so what happened is people began to think, well, this is actually a very good practice. Now, there is some evidence, some scholars have suggested that there were probably forms of private confession in some sense developing maybe in the 3rd century, around the 250s, but it wasn't universal everywhere.
Right.
And that what happened is as the movement took off in the late 3rd and really in the 4th century, the monastics became more and more important because they were ones defending orthodoxy. And so they kind of spread this practice in the East, and eventually in the West, it got really big because of the Irish missionaries, the Celtic missionaries and such, bringing it to everywhere. And eventually it was adopted. Now, I think either Socrates, his church historian, or Scholasticus in in their church histories talks about one of the reasons that private confession became a big deal was because I think in the 390s, the early 400s, after St. John Chrysostom, there was this case in which there was a cleric of the Church of Constantinople, of the Church of the main cathedral. They called it Hagia Sophia, but it wasn't the later Hagia Sophia. And he apparently had committed. A woman had committed a sin with him. I think committed fornication with him, with his deacon or a subdeacon or a priest or something like that. And she went and she confessed in a private circumstance because they were already beginning to introduce it to one of the presbyters. Okay. Well, the presbyter was like scandalized, and I guess he gave her some sort of penance and absolution, but he began to tell everybody that, this woman did this, and the clergyman who apparently had committed it got in trouble, and everybody was scandalized because people were like, well, are they just going to tell everybody what we've been doing in confession? And there was this 1-year period or so in which nobody went to confession because everybody was so scandalized and that's kind of how they established this like rules about seal of confession and such. And they, kind of organized the practice. This doesn't mean confession as a sacrament was invented in the 3rd or 4th century. It goes back to Christ's words to the apostles. Right. Receive the Holy Ghost. Whose sins you forgive, they are forgiven. Whose sins you don't forgive, they aren't forgiven. Now, but the outward manifestation in the ritual and rite in which it's been encapsulated, that did kind of develop over time.
Now, as I understand it, before the Revolution, I had heard that St. John of Kronstadt used a form of private confession, but it was one where, because of concerns about the changes in the Russian society and government at the time, everybody confessed at the same time, so nobody could actually understand or notice what the other people were saying. Yes. I saw a theoretical public form of confession by Schmemann, where basically what he was saying was it was something to the effect of listing off of the sins, and people were saying amen where they had committed them, so small sins added to great sins, you wouldn't be able to tell who was saying what. I don't know that that's a normative practice or one that would be necessarily good. I would think that in a situation where if persecution made it necessary, it could be done. I just don't. You'd
have to trust everybody around you.
Yeah, and it would have to be. That's the point where you're closing the doors when they say the doors.
Exactly, because remember, in monastic communities, according to the rule of Saint Benedict, there was something called the chapter office or the capitular office. And there was part of that capitular office, the second part of it, as I recall, as I know, which is called the chapter of faults, in which the chapter office or the chapter building is a closed building. No one who's not a monk's allowed in there. Doors are closed. And when they get to this part where the monks begin before the abbot publicly, in a public sense and privately, that is to the whole community of monks, they begin to confess their faults and their sins. And that actually goes back to the ancient monastic practice of the desert, but that even goes back to it was a preservation of the ancient church practice of open confession. All right, and people begin to say, I committed this transgression of the rule of our Father Benedict, I committed this sin, I committed that sin, and the abbot would give them penances. And after the first hour, he would also hear confessions, to kind of formalize things he had heard. So that has not entirely disappeared, at least after the time of the 400s. It continued in monastic communities. But if you're dealing with an enclosed a cloistered monastic community, let's say that followed the rule of Saint Benedict, or could have followed the rule of Saint Basil, I don't know if they did the same thing. You're dealing with people hopefully you've been with for years and you've learned to trust, and no one is supposed to be talking about sins they heard in the chapter of faults out to people outside the monastery or even outside the chapter of faults. So, but the question is, are most people comfortable with doing that in a parish or mission circumstance? And I don't think it would really work. And there have been enough instances where it barely worked in a monastic environment because of people, kind of bringing stuff up outside of the chapter of faults when they shouldn't have done it, that you can imagine in a mission or a small parish where open public confession would not be a good idea. Which is why the church in its wisdom has said private confession is the best way to deal with these things. So would it be valid if someone publicly came before a priest and said, Father, and they did a public confession and he gave him absolution? It would probably be valid, yes, but would it be a good idea? I think it probably wouldn't be a good idea, Father Joseph.
No, and I would agree. I wasn't endorsing.
No, I understand. I'm just saying. I mean, St. John of Kronstadt, I know people use the excuse that, well, a saint did it and, et cetera, et cetera. But he was a saint and he did have spiritual vision.
He was a different kind of,
he could see into people's souls in a way that most other people couldn't see.
So yeah, he was very unique. So I wouldn't. The point.
Now remember, St. John of Kronstadt also kind of promoted the idea of having services translated into kind of a high form of vernacular Russian. He wanted the secret prayers read out loud. That were ones done at the end of the litanies and such.
Well, some people do that.
So not everything that he did that kind of became later somewhat controversial. There were people who had different opinions about that. For example, like supposedly. I think maybe Satan just the elder, I shouldn't say, the Father Justin Popovich kind of said, well, maybe we should read some of these prayers out loud. But there have been a lot of people who have negatively reacted to things like that and said that they should be kept secret continuously. So what were you going to say, Father?
Oh no, I wasn't. That was basically my point that he because of his uniqueness, it was that basically you can't always. It doesn't mean it's a good example for everyone. It's a good example for what he was doing at the time in his circumstances. So you can't really use it that way. So I hope that helps, Matthew. Justice for Orthodoxy, does the GOCK still retain grace? Yeah, pretty much, I guess.
I don't know.
I am not. I say.
I don't know because I'm not in communion with them, so I have no real reason to make a judgment on them. I would never limit. I would not limit. Orthodoxy. We're not in communion with ROAC either. Does that mean they're not Orthodox? Well, I would say ROAC would be different, but okay.
The point I'm trying to make is that, and I know your reason for saying that, and I agree with you. From our perspective, the GOC. Under Archbishop Kalinikos, then under before they were even under Archbishop Chrysostom, started because of the trial, however illegal it was, of their archpastor. I would say that, it was an illegal trial. The formation of the synod was to some degree a parricide. Did we depose their bishops? We did not. I think Archbishop Maxentius did depose a number of them, and then they united with another faction. The difficulties in that is just whether or not I personally am not sure. They haven't deviated, I don't think, in terms of their teaching, except occasionally they've tried to reach out more in the public eye to Constantinople. That was back in the 80s. Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question. I certainly don't consider them to be the ranking hierarchy of Greece. I don't consider that there is a ranking hierarchy of Greece because you have so many warring archbishops and so on and so forth. I would say that their question is canonically unresolved. I wouldn't make a question on Greece. I just wouldn't.
Yeah, I think that's a fair question.
I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that. So I know that that's not a. I would say the same thing about the Matthewites. So the point is, I don't know that I could, choose one side and say, well, this side was universally right, because they were all wrong in the 1970s, and it just gets really awful. Is my point. And so I'd like to believe everyone has, everyone in their churches has grace. Again, I don't know. I mean, they're not heretics. I'll put it that way. At best, you could say that there's schism, but there's so much schism in Greece, it's difficult to determine who's right on that. And I mean, the point is, even the Greek synod we're in communion with technically is not a reigning synod, because there's only one reigning see in it, and it's a minor see. So it's hard for me to say. I don't, that's just my feeling. I don't want to become hyper partisan and say only the people in communion with us are Orthodox. That's hypocritical. We were in communion with Patriarch Volodymyr, which ties very interestingly into this case that's happening in Ukraine, because now the MP is trying to rehabilitate his memory, and he was
which is interesting considering what they used to do to him.
Well, yeah, but the point is, and that's my point, that they're talking about the Ukrainian Sergianists. They're not talking about the Russian Sergianists, and it's not like he would have had a different opinion of them.
Well, and remember, they published a sermon was recently published from Patriarch Volodymyr Romaniuk back in 1995, where he basically, in the harshest terms, condemned Sergianism. It says that they're non-canonical, and he doesn't consider them part of the church.
Yeah, and so
so I mean, I know we're kind of bringing that. Everything kind of is going back to Ukraine for some reason.
That's an interesting point, because then the question becomes, well, Patriarch Volodymyr was right, and he was clearly a confessor of the faith. Was he a legitimate patriarch? Because those are the questions we're asking now. Should he have gotten his approval from Constantinople? Could he have? And that it starts getting into all sorts of thorny questions. Or was he did he effectively create a Kievan patriarchate, or did the people of their church create a Kievan patriarchate?
That's interesting. Maybe that's an interesting point to now bring up. I don't know if we have any more questions on the war zone we can really talk about. There's this one question that we can connect it to this. Is living in the West, where there are several Orthodox jurisdictions, how do I know which one to belong to? What if someone is baptized in jurisdiction A, but then always goes to the services of B, for example?
Well,
so that question.
And I think that's a relevant question. That has been relevant. I hope, Justice, we've helped so far with our answer. I don't know if it was helpful or if it just sounded mushy, but the point is that I think that we have a very practical answer to that question. Because if someone is baptized in jurisdiction A, assuming that the proper form of baptism was used, and they go to jurisdiction B, who have only recently declared each other in schism, it would seem ridiculous to say that they're not baptized. Because
the question, though, is about how do you determine what's the true jurisdiction or not? And they're talking about tracing apostolic succession and lines of ordination.
Well, that just doesn't make sense.
See, the problem is that's in a sense important. But but apostolic succession, ordination lines, they don't matter if you don't teach the Orthodox faith.
Basically, yeah.
If for example, the Monophysites, the Nestorians, have quote unquote hierarchical succession in a sense of a formal, someone laid hands and read these prayers, and then someone laid hands and read those prayers. But do they have grace? No, because why? They don't teach the Orthodox faith. All right. So the question is, do they teach the Orthodox faith, one? And two, do they repudiate communion with all heretics? And why the second point? Because Orthodox have had this long experience with people who said they're Orthodox in communion with Rome, like the Byzantine Union.
The Unions.
Yeah. I've heard that so many times, they'll say, I agree with Orthodox theology and I don't agree with the Pope. But my point is that you're in communion with the Pope. So you may personally not agree with him, but if you're in communion with him, you're not Orthodox. If someone says they accept Orthodoxy, but they're knowingly in union with like open manifest heretics
for like
right?
1,000 years.
Pardon me?
For like
for 1,000 years. Yeah. And the other point is that knowingly, because, you have to say knowingly, because there's always going to be some case in which someone's in communion theoretically with some bishop, and that bishop, has a priest who does something, crazy, and you don't know about it. And then someone years later says, well, Bishop so-and-so in this country had a priest who did this, and you were in communion with him, and, he did this wrong. Therefore, you lose grace because of what this one priest did. And that's just not how the church works. In that case, you have to know about it and bear responsibility for dealing with things. For example, look at St. Athanasius. St. Athanasius had to break communion 3 times with Marcellus of Ancyra, because Marcellus of Ancyra 3 times was teaching Sabellianism. And St. Athanasius tried to repair things with him. I think he repaired it with him the 3rd time or something like that. At least the discussion in regards to the word Orthodox has actually gone beyond. A lot of them have seen beyond the concept of you're going to be in communion with a patriarch. That's really what matters. Because, Bartholomew says that these
exposed.
Because Bartholomew says Philaret and the Macarius bishops are in communion with him and they're under him. But Moscow's like, well, that doesn't matter. They're still schismatics and heretics. So, but people forget that used to be the big thing. It wasn't just, communion with Constantinople. They said, well, if you're under a patriarch or in communion with him, that kind of resolves everything, But no, that whole thing has been exploded.
And it's funny when we say it used to be, we're talking about last year.
Exactly. Right.
The point is that the whole thing is horrifying, because if you look at it, okay, so you have Constantinople, who's kind of claiming that they're in communion with the Pope, and the whole Uniates are going to be involved in the whole autocephaly thing, and so Moscow makes a hard line and says we're not going to accept Eastern Papism, which is a heresy, 100% true. And basically, some of them take it further and talk about, the EP's relationships with the Pope. That's 100% true. And so they break communion, 100% valid. But then they go further and say, well, you know what, we should go talk to the Pope. Well, that kind of doesn't make sense.
Well, yeah, because Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeev goes to Rome and says, I'm informing the Pope. And there was I sent you that video.
Why is he doing that?
Well, I sent you that YouTube video, which was an interview with Hilarion Alfeev, and if you know a little bit of Russian, you can kind of figure out what he's saying. He's like, he mentions the word the Pope Francis 30 times in a 15-minute interview. It's like every 30 seconds he's mentioning Pope Francis. I talked to Pope Francis about this. I informed him about this. We asked his advice. Maybe he could mediate. So
why would you ask the Pope to mediate?
Well, I think it's because there's a dichotomy here. The people at the very top, like Patriarch Kirill and Metropolitan Hilarion Alfeev, due to the fact that, remember, Patriarch Kirill, when he had Hilarion Alfeev's old job, he was meeting with Pope Benedict or whoever all the time. So my point is, these people have not changed. Even if you have kind of conservative fighting from within people trying to get into power and scratch their way up in the MP, they've got a long way to go. And every day it looks less and less like they're going to be able to turn this into more than just some, fight over Ukrainian territory, because even in Ukraine, many of these Ukrainian Moscow Patriarch bishops are saying stuff like, "Well, we might join when a Tomos is issued," and such.
Well, and I think
not all of them, but some of them are even saying that. And so, why go to the Pope? It's because I think that, as much as some people want this to be a break over ecumenist Constantinople and supposedly anti-ecumenist traditionalist Moscow, I think it's much more complicated than that.
And I think that the worst part of this is that in the end, one of the things that was brought up recently on orthochristian.com, and it was brought up by an MP priest, and he laid out a number of the Kiev Patriarchate hierarchs that were, kind of bent by the FSB. One thing that he lays out is that basically Patriarch Vladimir was murdered.
Oh no, we know we've known that for some time. Yeah, we have.
Okay. Well, Kevin Walker wrote, "While I'm with GOCK, goodbye." Well, that's too bad, because I thought you were starting some sort of Anglican prayer group on the Warzone or one of the other groups, but that's okay. you do your thing. Good luck with that. I don't think I was rude. I have friends in the GOCK, so good luck with that. I don't mind. So
make sure you're not confusing him with somebody else.
Yeah, I might be, but sorry about that. Then he kind of looks like the other guy. Yeah, he might be a different guy. Sorry, Kevin, you're not the Anglican guy. Sorry, I just looked that up. But in any case, sorry.
This is the problem when people come in here and they ask us, "What is your position about this other old calendar for Orthodox?"
And that's fine. They have a right to ask.
Because I can guarantee you, if you went to GSCK people and they asked them about us, they'd be like, "Well, we don't know," or "They're not Orthodox." That's exactly what they say.
Flat out
so, but it somehow becomes bad when we say essentially the same thing. Like we're not really going to say we don't really know. I mean, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's silly because every single GOC group holds almost the exact same position on everyone else that we do. We're just saying that, we don't know. And by the way, that actually got us accused. I remember there was an accusation that's made up charge of jurisdictional ecumenism.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Years ago, we used to say, well, maybe we can't condemn everybody and we have to be, maybe there could be some leniency. And they're like, oh, that's ecumenism.
Yeah, and it's like, okay, well, fine.
So we just stopped saying it, and we said we don't know, or we don't, or even in some cases we said this group is not. We consider them not to have grace, and they're like, "How dare you say that?" So it's like it's damned if you do, damned if you don't.
You're never going to win. So all you can do is just you pray for people, and so good luck, Kevin. You're in my prayers.
But the point is that in this article by this Ukrainian journalist that's on pravoslavy.ru or something, but I know there's the English translation, orthochristian.org or something like that. I can't remember what it is. No, they admit that Patriarch Volodymyr was basically... Now, the writer writing it was writing from a Moscow Patriarch perspective, but he was still kind of sympathetic, I could tell.
Yeah.
Because how are you going to attack Vladimir Romaniuk, who was putting labor... I mean, and this writer basically admitted Vladimir Romaniuk spent most of his life in labor camps or concentration camps.
Right, and he even said, he's like, I'm not endorsing his schism or anything, but he was still obviously a very good man.
Exactly.
The point is, clearly he had no real beef that he could come up with against Patriarch Volodymyr, but what's more important is, and I didn't get this point in before I saw that the goodbye thing, which is, if they're saying that Patriarch Romaniuk was murdered, and most likely by Filaret's faction, that means that Constantinople is not simply elevating a non-canonical person, they're elevating a murderer. And so the point is, if they are elevating a murderer, that is a much bigger charge than, anything else. And the fact that some MP bishops are like, well, we'll go with the murderer now, that's even worse.
And remember, technically, Filaret Denisenko has basically been continuously trying to pretend that Romaniuk never lived. He never existed. And remember, and as the journalist points out, Patriarch Volodymyr basically said, when I die, bury me in this so-and-so cemetery outside of Kiev, so there's not a big deal about it. But Filaret said, Filaret, took advantage of the fact that, as we believe he had Volodymyr killed, to say, no, he's going to be buried outside of St. Sophia's, which he knew was going to cause a big, gigantic riot. And, and it, what's it called, Black Tuesday or something like that,
Yeah, and it was just probably to purge out.
And as they point out, the last year of Volodymyr's patriarchate in Kiev, he basically was, trying to, as much as possible, get the Ukrainian Department of Justice involved in investigating Filaret, and he asked for police protection from Filaret. Now, we knew this years ago. I knew this years ago. I guess this has now finally become, the Moscow Patriarchate is basically promoting all this because it's useful for them. It's also but it's still the truth. So, I mean, I don't care why people do it as long as it's the truth, So they're dealing with kind of a Filaret Denisenko person who, he's kind of the worst of the Soviet system, if you might say.
Yeah.
The Soviet Sergianist system. And he was able to fool people for a certain amount of time as supposedly being repentant about everything. But and in fact, if you read that one last sermon Patriarch Volodymyr did, it was almost 4 months before he died, where he condemned the Sergianists. You can tell, knowing the history of how he was trying to avoid Filaret those last periods of his life. He wanted nothing to do with him. He was trying to find some way to get him deposed. He was, they were trying to hold synod meetings, and as soon as Volodymyr would try to go to a synod meeting, so suddenly these protesters would come out of nowhere and start threatening to kill him, and he couldn't even go. So you see what happened, and but if you read that sermon, you can tell he was talking more than about the MP. He was talking about Filaret, in my opinion, about people who were claiming to be repentant and they really weren't, as such.
Well, no, I do want to, I do want to like focus on other topics because, frankly, Orthodoxy versus everyone is, still talking Orthodoxy versus Orthodoxy.
Yeah, I know.
It's, we will answer any question. We're not, okay. Is the EP Orthodox?
No.
I think the whole point is, if I'm pointing out that we're really trying to talk about other things, the question of whether the EP is Orthodox, well, I can say at least Bartholomew's not a Mason. But
I know, but I'm saying if they're asking the position of us as a true Orthodox church, we would say no. People may disagree with that, but that's our position.
Well, I know,
but technically, the Moscow Patriarchate would technically now say the EP is an Orthodox. So
yeah,
that's becoming a popular position now.
Exactly. Everyone's saying that, but the point is, that's unfortunately what's going to. As it's gonna, that's how it works. I hate to say it, but unfortunately.
Okay, well, we got to come up with other questions besides just the traditional, what do we say about the world Orthodox, or what do we say about Ukraine? I mean, is there really anything we're going to talk about besides that?
Well, exactly. I was kind of hoping we talk about different things, and we're talking about the same things we talk about on the Apologetics channel. I mean, on the Apologetics show, which is fine. I am curious about why.
Okay, here's something to talk about, because Orthodoxy versus everyone. I recently posted something about the policy, and this does relate to Orthodoxy, and how Orthodoxy relates to politics in the civil world and such.
Mm-hmm.
That in the Byzantine Empire, they essentially had a state-run or state-supported healthcare system. All right. And it was considered basically a normative thing, or at least a proper thing to do, because it was an extension of Christian charity. The article says it's an article called "Medicine in the Byzantine Empire" by Neos Cosmos, or that's the name of the blog or the website. And it says the great hospitals were run cooperatively by the state, the church, and the noble families of the empire. Medical care in the hospitals was always provided free of charge for the poor, while the well-off were charged in accordance with the magnitude of their wealth. Many noble families, such as the Thessalinoi and the Komninoi, granted large tracts of land to the hospitals, which provided them with a steady income with which to fund their activities. Now, immediately, I got like 15 shares within a short period of time about this, because a lot of people were pointing, because there's a lot of debate about whether you should have universal health care or not and such, and this kind of does relate to that, and in the sense that Orthodox empires, at least the Byzantine Empire, I don't necessarily know how the Russian Empire behaved on this, thought that there should be some sort of establishment by the state, although the state cooperated with the hierarchy to fund hospitals. And there is nothing inherently wrong with that. And it's not, so my opinion, I don't know if you disagree, Father Joseph, is that it would be wrong to say that in and of itself, the concept of some sort of state-supported or welfare system is socialism, because there's a difference between saying, oh, your property is owned collectively, as opposed to saying that the state should at least, at a minimum, fund hospitals for poor people. Now, would you disagree or agree? I think Father Joseph has left. I'm not sure why. I think he was going to leave.
I haven't left.
I'm sorry.
No, sorry about that. I was having some problems with my microphone. What I was saying was that, no, I don't know that it necessarily is in disagreement with the idea of a nationalized healthcare system. I'm not necessarily against that. But what is effectively being described, if we're to put it in modern terms, what was effectively being described in this description of Byzantine society was closer to a single-payer system than it was to anything else. Our system is very, very different, because it is not simply the government, the church, and the rich families of the empire were providing the healthcare. It's literally, a conglomerate of various companies which have government regulation that are charging whatever, what they want, and they have to raise prices by certain amounts, and a lot of crazy stuff. It's a profit-based system. So I don't know that, that we could say that that's exactly what, I mean, the closest you could come to that would be, some form of Christianized single payer. But of course, a secular single payer in modern society would be, it would be nightmarish, because then one of the biggest providers of healthcare in the country is the Catholic hospital system. And then you start, whenever politics gets involved, then questions like birth control and abortions, are those considered healthcare? I think it's a much more complicated question than just the government can provide the healthcare. And I think we're seeing that play out right now as things are going on. And so it's not as simple as just the church was okay with free healthcare. Well, yes, if the church was the primary one providing it, along with the Christian government and the noble families, but that's not the reality we live in today. So I certainly wouldn't use it as an argument for Obamacare.
Oh, no. I agree. I'm just saying that the concept is not. You can't say someone's not Orthodox because they support the social welfare system.
I don't know anyone who would say that.
Well, there are some people, who tried to make the argument.
You can't be Orthodox if you.
There are people who try to make the argument where they're trying to say that kind of neoliberal or kind of a Goldwater conservatism is the only consistent Christian position because taxation is theft. Therefore, that's kind of this extreme libertarian position. And my point is that kind of technically conflicts with Romans 13 and the other biblical admonitions that, taxation, at least in some form, is not antithetical to a moral system.
Well, so, I think that, again, what they're describing, even when you're talking about government intervention in healthcare, even when you're talking about in Orthodox nations, from what I understood, the government was largely involved in healthcare until the revolution. So, I mean, we were a different story because of the fact that we had a very privatized healthcare system, but it was still run by networks of churches. Whether they were Roman Catholic or Methodist or Presbyterian. I mean, you still see those on most of the hospitals in the U.S. today. So the point is that even then, it was not individualistic healthcare by any means. It was some sort of deviation from the norm, where you had the occasional municipal hospital, the churches, of the various denominations running hospitals, and obviously rich parishioners who were helping them, and so on and so forth. So again, there was a private versus public kind of system of healthcare, but until the rise of the medical insurance industry, which would come up later, it's just not even a real comparison. I can't argue.
Well, you mentioned the Byzantine system was almost kind of like a Christian single payer system. If you think about it, you have the prison system where they have kind of like privatized prisons and such. And a privatized prison system is actually much worse, I think, than one just run by the government.
Oh, no!
There's a horrific profit motive where basically they, there was like some prison corps of America or whatever signs a contract with, let's say, Kentucky or Tennessee, saying we'll build these prisons, but you have to guarantee they be filled. Now, how is the state going to guarantee?
Well, there was a perfect example of that became famous in Pennsylvania, actually not far from where I live, and one of the judges involved was actually they did a parole hearing for him, and it didn't go over well. But the point is, that's literally what happened. And what happened was, what they did was, in a lot of poor neighborhoods, public school kids, for anything from things like, spitting out gum or, putting it under the desk, were assigned to short terms in private prisons. I mean, they were talking about 13, 14-year-old kids. And they were, their lives were upended by this, this horrific experience. And it was called the Kids for Cash saga, because what had happened was it had been determined that a lot of these cases had kickbacks, that the prison companies were paying the judges to get a certain quota of kids into the prisons. So the point is, that it's not even a theoretical possibility. It really happened here, and we're still looking at the I guess you'd say the end results.
So my point is that oftentimes having a government-run single-payer healthcare system or just a state-run prison system is much better, even if you may say it's more inefficient than having some kind of weird, corrupted, private, corporate, government profit partnership. Because if you have a competition in things like getting prisoners or who's going to extract the most amount of money out of somebody for healthcare bills, that's just a perverse
system to begin with. Yeah. So I mean, you can't fix the current insurance system as it is through, I guess you could say, free market incentives, because it's already not a free market. It's a closed market with a lot of power players in it who aren't going to share power. And so by mollifying it, which is why that's the real reason Obamacare failed so badly, is because they mollified these power players and basically handed them power over the entire medical system. And so unfortunately that worked out as it did. And, while I'm hopeful for possibly the current government to kind of open that up a little bit, I'm just thankful that they've taken away the mandate that requires everyone who doesn't want to pay into the system to suddenly do so.
Okay. Any more? Were there any other subjects you want to discuss, Father?
Well, I mean, we can talk about different things. I mean, I think we saw, I think we offended some people, and I apologize. That's really the best we can do. We're not going to lie, and we're not going to pander to get viewers. Our job is to defend Orthodoxy. We really want to look at the Orthodox position versus everything, versus modern life, whether it's Hollywood, whether you want to talk about different religious groups, it's fine. But, if people want to pigeonhole us and say, well, they're non-canonical, well, it's stupid. No one's canonical anymore. Let's face the reality. So when we can start talking about Orthodoxy, then hopefully things will get better. It's a tough situation all over the world right now. And that's why a lot of people are worried, but there's nothing really to worry about. As long as you are defending the Orthodox faith, you're going to be fine. And I know that sounds like it's not a very nice answer. It's certainly not a political answer, but you're going to have to come to terms with the fact that canonicity is not determined by anything but the canons. And so if you're not following them, if you're in a situation where if somebody says that person's uncanonical, at this point, you need to ask them why. You need to be able to say, okay, they're uncanonical, tell me why. And you need to know your canons. Everyone who's ever worked or dealt with Orthodox apologists needs to know their canons. When are polemics necessary? That's Matthew Thompson. Good question. It depends on how you define polemics. I mean, if you're talking about defending the faith, they're necessary whenever it comes up. If somebody comes up to you and says, icons are stupid, you should have a ready defense for it. You have to be able to answer people. And this is something that,
polemics is going on the attack, though.
Well, polemics is going on the attack, but sometimes the attack is itself a defense. If someone is writing hundreds of articles that are false about Orthodoxy, and you write an article back, someone can say, well, that's a polemic. No, that's a defense. The point is, the term polemic is itself a loaded term, because polemic is subjective. And what I mean by that is that what looks like defense to one person could look like polemic to another. And so, Orthodox apologists must have the cannons ready to fire. Get it? Cannon, boom. Aha. Womp, womp. In any case, you should have the cannons. You should be knowledgeable about them. There's nothing wrong. A lot of people, this is something that you have to realize that, again, this generation is luckier than previous generations because you have access to the canons that didn't exist 20 years ago. 20 years ago, the only way you saw the canons was through the Erdman set. And if you were lucky, you might have seen someone with a Rudder, which was very rare. But the point is that before that, the canons were considered this hidden text. And so,
and you every now and again you encounter people who say you're not allowed to read the Rudder. I don't know if you've encountered that.
I heard that a lot from a lot of people, and they'd be like, you don't have permission to read the Rudder. The Rudder is for bishops. Okay, yeah, the Rudder's for bishops. You're not allowed to, anathematize heretics personally.
But St. Nicodemus wasn't a bishop, and he wrote the common. St. Nicodemus wasn't even a priest, I don't believe. Hieromonk Agapius was, but I don't even think St. Nicodemus was a priest, was he?
No, I don't think he was.
So just some monk basically writes a commentary.
Monk is kind of, he was a monk of the Holy Mountain, and he was, obviously a very learned monk. But more importantly, the point is that the canons are useful to know because that way you understand how you can understand how the church is applying them. And so it's an important thing. I don't think that I think if you're going to get into the business of defending Orthodoxy, you should know how to defend it properly. I've pointed out because I was very lucky to have an early acquaintance with the canons when I was younger, to realize that, for example, there's no canon that really defends anything that Roman Catholicism has. So if you ask, one of the few questions that I asked in a debate, 10 years ago or so, with someone, or longer, I forget, 15. The point is, I said, we had a question and answer session. I said, which of the canons defends Roman primacy? And immediately the person had to say, well, the primacy doesn't come from canons. Well, guess what? If you can't find how the canonical structure of something exists within the canons of the church, then it doesn't exist. It's not there, and it's made up. So it's a very useful thing to have.
Let me bring up another subject, a very controversial subject.
Okay.
All right. There was a question that we both answered separately and had, I guess, slightly different answers on, and on two different live streams. There was the one you were on without me, and I did one on traditional Western Orthodoxy without you. And it was, what does the church accept, civic nationalism or ethno-nationalism? And what I said is that there are forms of both that are completely unacceptable, and there are forms of both that can, in theory, be acceptable. And why I said that is because theoretically, let's say you have a form of civic nationalism in the late Roman Empire before it became Christian. Okay, that was essentially what you had in the 3rd century in the Roman Empire. But that civic nationalism was based upon what? It was based upon paganism and concepts of giving divine honors to these, kind of the family gods of the emperor. All right. So that would be an example of civic nationalism that the Orthodox Church would say absolutely is not acceptable. Okay. But conversely, let's say the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, had a policy that they didn't want the Danes coming in and invading England. And the concept was that basically they wanted to keep the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, basically everybody had to speak English and be Anglo-Saxon, or if you came in, you had to in some way assimilate to being an Anglo-Saxon or whatever. And that was effectively a type of primitive ethno-nationalism, I guess. But it wasn't directed as a form of hatred, my point is.
But I wouldn't even call that a form of ethno-nationalism. Argentina holds the exact same policy, and it doesn't matter what country.
Well, what I mean is, for example, if some countries said 95% of the current country's ethnic makeup must be the same, like Mexico's got a policy like that, for example.
Yeah, well, Mexico, I don't agree with Mexico's policy.
Well, my point is that I can't see that as being technically a heretical position to say the current ethnic makeup of, let's say, Hungary must be 95% Hungarian, no matter what happens.
I don't think that's. I don't think it's heretical or not heretical. I don't think it's related.
My point is that all I'm saying is that I think that would be a form of ethnic nationalism that would be acceptable, as opposed to there are other forms of ethno-nationalism that would not be, like, let's start killing people or burning down their villages because we don't like their ethnic group and things like that.
Well, I would think that the first one is less a question of nationalism and more a question of what government considers acceptable to their borders. I think that, unfortunately, and when we start talking about people burning down villages of other ethnic groups, that is an actual form. I hate to say it, it's actual ethno-nationalism, because you're basically declaring superiority over the people.
My point is that nationalism believes your country, you give priority to your country above most other things, or your nation or whatever. Now, the Orthodox would have to temper that by. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say neither of those are compatible with Orthodoxy, because you're not supposed to put the state over everything to begin.
I know, but I'm saying is that the Orthodox answer would that you'd have to temper that by saying that the Orthodox faith should be the primary thing, and that concern for the nation or the ethnic group should be a secondary concern.
Well, yeah, but that's not tempering it. That's literally changing it. And what I mean by that, and I'm not trying to be argumentative, Father, but
that's good. Let's be argumentative.
Well, no, what I'm saying is that if a person is saying nationalism is placing the state primarily for ethnic or other reasons above other concerns,
ethnic nationalism would be
right. Okay, fine. The point is, I would say that you could say do that in a form of civic nationalism as well. The point I'm trying to make is, at that point, when you're saying "but God comes first," it's a ... but God comes first. It's effectively saying, okay, well, we're going to pay lip service to the sign of the cross, but we don't really care. We're more concerned about the country. If you say, no, you must put God first, you have subverted the very definition you gave. because it is no longer nationalism.
Well, no, the reason I say that is because, for example, let's say you're Romania. Okay, let's just give Romania as an example.
All right.
Everybody kind of knows the Vlach people. That's the Romanian ethnicity, more or less. All right, it kind of formed as a combination of the Latin colonists with the Dacian native Dacians, and they basically by the Middle Ages, the ethnogenesis occurred, and the Vlach people, the Romanian people, kind of came about. All right. Okay. And the identity of the Romanian people has been intricately tied to Orthodox Christianity. All right. Okay. So that someone could, when Romania became, wanted to become independent, and it always to some extent was independent, under like the, Wallachian princes and or Transylvanian, etc. Having some kind of agreement with the Ottomans or fighting them and things like that. But the concept was that, we should have one Romanian nation. But the Romanian Orthodox, like the saintly figures in the 18th and 19th century who supported the independence of all of Romania and its liberation from the Ottomans, their view is that this cannot be done just for the secular reasons of let's just have our own country. Because if you do that, then what's the point of having a country? What's the point of doing anything if you don't have salvation and you don't have a higher reason of the gospel to attempt to leaven your whole culture and your whole people? That's all I'm saying. All right. Yeah. So my point is that my point is that I think that was the problem with a lot of nationalism in the 19th and 20th century is they essentially tried to turn into even if they were they tried to turn into secular ethnic nationalism where it came about the ethnic group is all the ethnic all for like like La Raza used to say everything for those in the race, nothing for those outside the race. But it became the same thing for all the other groups too.
Yeah, but now this is something that I've actually argued with La Raza people because a lot of people don't realize this, but La Raza, the name La Raza comes from the book by Vasconcelos called La Raza Cosmica. Now, Vasconcelos was a devout Catholic, and the very purpose of the book, if you can get past the stupid legends of the Atlanteans and stuff that you find in racial books of that time period. Ultimately, his argument was that the church unites all the ethnic groups together to create a new race, a cosmic race. That's actually that's a very Roman, but also a very Christian idea. But then, of course, when I talk to people, from these, that are in these La Raza groups, a lot of the times they're just like, oh, well, that sounds nice, but I don't really believe that. Well, guess what? You're undermining the very meaning of the term that Vasconcelos created. So the point is, from my perspective, when I talk to people about La Raza, I bring up La Raza Cosmica. I bring it up, and I will use that as an argument to say, as you can clearly see, what Vasconcelos, the guy who came up with the term, was saying was that the church unites you as an ethnos. The church makes you an ethnos, just like it did with the Romanians. The church made them, took two, these fused cultures, created one that was Christian. And that is an acceptable nationalism. But that is not an ethno-nationalism. It is not a civic nationalism. It is a divine nationalism we find at Pentecost. And I will defend that to the death.
No, but I don't know if I'm disagreeing with you or not. I'm trying to clear that up. I'm just saying is that if someone says they want their country to be 95% Romanian, is that bad to say that, to say they want their country to remain Romanian or Hungarian? Because you're not even getting into even racial questions. They were getting into because the Romanians would technically say we don't want, 2 million Hungarians moving in because that's not part of who our culture is.
Well, and I don't think that, well, I think that that's not even the church's concern. I think that's the country's concern. And I think they have a perfect concern about cultural dilution.
Well, then the question is then to what extent, so a lot of these questions of ethnic nationalism are artificial questions being raised because what? There's breaking down of borders. Countries are becoming less independent. I don't know what it's all coming. It's not just because of ethnic hatred. There's other things that are fanning that are making that more exacerbating it.
Well, I don't disagree. And if you take, the example of Europe, for example, where you have all these, this whole migration thing, so on and so forth. What we do know is that power elites such as George Soros and others, the Open Society Foundation, are interested in creating, by what they're doing is effectively by dismantling the structures of ethnic and national identity, it allows them more control. And the biggest opponent in that is the church in that sense, because once you take away Christian identity, everything falls apart. And when I say Christian identity, I don't mean the Christian identity movement. I mean your actual identity as a Christian. Once that is destroyed, then it is easy to turn everyone into consumer slots. And if you want the biggest proof of that, look no further than the good old US of A. Because frankly, this country has always been largely a Protestant nation, but now it's barely even it's a nominal Protestant nation. And
well, even in the case of you look at the case of all the big migrant crisis, and that's coming mostly because of, I know, like, people like to attack them, and of course, there's all these crazy Islamic migrants, and they're really incompatible with European society. That's true, but you think about it, all these wars, like in Libya and in Syria, that's like dry. Like, remember what Gaddafi said? He said, after me. He was almost like Louis the 14th, who said, "After me, the flood." And the same thing. So, it's not just kind of some abstract thing. Oh, they're just migrating to Europe out of nowhere. There's other stuff going on.
Yeah.
So
absolutely, and I agree. And I would have to say ultimately that this, because of these kind of movements that are being promoted. And I hate to, bring up the dead boy on the shore and all the way the media made that like the story of migration in Europe. The reality is that it is becoming horrifying. Just recently in England, there have been talk for at least 2 years about these grooming gangs that were abusing girls, and they were doing it on a race-based sort of way. Attacking European girls in England and so on and so forth. Well, most of I think like 35 of them got like life sentences concurrent for like 210 years. But it took 2 years to do it. And meanwhile, hundreds and hundreds of people, I've mentioned this in a previous show, hundreds of women their lives are completely messed up. Their psychology is completely broken. And this is something that, we have to look in terms of these power elites and say this is a direct result of their actions. And I'll say this: I'm not against the idea of armed Orthodox brotherhoods. I'm literally not. What I don't want to see is armed brotherhoods pretending to be Orthodox that have other agendas in mind.
Yes, no, we don't want, for example, someone saying, "We're an Orthodox Brotherhood, but we're only here to protect the white people, and we don't care about everybody else."
Hispanic people,
or any group, yeah, and that's going to be the problem, because you look at the Russian Empire historically, and it had many problems, but it did encompass multiple different ethnic and racial groups, and they each were allowed to have, but the concept of the Tsars wanted Orthodoxy to be the unifying aspect of all these different peoples with all their disparate cultures. And some people argue to what extent did that work, but I think it worked better than not having Orthodoxy. So there's a question. So anyway, I'm just saying that's a valid question that has to be discussed a lot, because there's just no way about it, and if you don't, everybody just accepts kind of more and more secular theories about things, and they get to forms of nationalism and that go beyond just, I want my country to be independent and continue the same as my grandfathers. It goes to, I'm better than everybody else, and people need to leave or surrender their land to me. You know what I mean? That there's a point which it goes beyond just I love my country.
Absolutely.
The other question by Matthew Thompson is, do Orthodox accept Augustine's just war theory, or is there an Orthodox war theory? I'll let you go first, Father, and then I'll answer.
Okay, well, if we look at the roots of St. Augustine's just war theory, basically what he's talking about is largely he's talking about behavior in war, and unfortunately, this is it's undergirded by the assumption that the military in question is Christian to begin with, and that there are certain behaviors that we can't engage in. As for whether there is an Orthodox war theory, and I'll expand on what I just said, I would say that it's not so much an Orthodox war theory, but you have the example of the soldier saints of the various lands, of course the most famous being Alexander Nevsky. But the point is, you can gather from that while Christians in general should oppose war, at the same time, if war is necessary on the part of the government, Christians should do their best to mitigate it with justice or mitigate it with goodness. To give a really horrible example of this, I know I've spoken to soldiers who were traumatized by some of the things that they saw, in the Gulf War and in Afghanistan. But then there were other things that I had heard, and I remember once I was sitting in a train, and as again, I have nothing but respect for our military in general. But I was sitting in a train, and I heard a few soldiers talking behind me. They were talking about I believe it was in Iraq, and what they had said was at one point for fun, they shot some guy who was already a captive in his large toes. And the reason for this is that the large toe effectively keeps you standing. It helps cement your ability to stand. So if you shoot out somebody's large toes, eventually the person can't stand up or walk straight. And then basically they were talking about, just basically like, he was still like cursing and angry. And so they told him to start running, and he couldn't run. He was flopping all over the place, and then he was shot. But the point I'm trying to make is that the guys who were saying this thought it was funny. I don't think that any saint, soldier or not soldier, would ever approve of effectively torturing a person for fun. And I'm not blaming soldiers for that. What I'm saying is we live in a society that glorifies that, whether it's through horror movies, whether it's through, other, things where we basically, these bum fights was another famous thing that they did in the 90s where they paid, these homeless guys to fight each other. I think that when you're in a society that is already displaying aspects of a moral sickness, that even just war theory, regardless Geneva Conventions or no Geneva Conventions, becomes harder and harder to accomplish because you're dealing with a moral sense of people. And this is even worse because when you're talking about Islamic countries, the Islamic system is not exactly known for its morality either. So the point is, it becomes increasingly barbaric. And so that's something that, unfortunately we have to look at.
Well, remember St. Augustine, and I'm pulling up the quotes from the City of God. Okay. St. Augustine says, "They who have waged war in obedience to the divine command or in conformity with his laws have represented in their persons the public justice or the wisdom of government, and in this capacity have put to death wicked men. Such persons have by no means violated the commandment, thou shalt not kill." And then again in the City of God, St. Augustine says, "But say they, the wise man will wage just wars, as if he would not all the rather lament the necessity of just wars, if he remembers that he is a man. For if they were not just, he would not wage them, and would therefore be delivered from all wars." So St. Augustine wasn't endorsing war as some great thing. He's saying if the just man should lament the fact that he has to even wage a just war. And just war theory actually kind of goes back before up to think what Cicero, that you had to have certain requirements. It had to be in the self-defense of the country. It had to be for a greater moral good. You couldn't do things in the war that would harm civilians. You couldn't do things that would violate general morality. People think of it as a justification for war, but if you look at warfare prior to, the Christian advent and taking over the empire, when the Romans would attack an area, they would, often in many cases, if the people refused to surrender, they just kill everybody. Yeah, for example, when Julius Caesar attacked people, if you read De Bello Gallico, where Caesar writes about, he's basically his report to the Roman Senate, where he waged his 10-year campaign on the Gauls. He killed about 1/3 to 1/2 the population, and the other half he enslaved, or he basically, let flee off into the villages and, be effectively kind of slaves to the Romans until he trusted them. So we think he killed about maybe 1 million people, which was a massive amount of people in 60 BC. So that used to be the way people, the Romans would wage war. If you didn't surrender, then they're going to kill all you. So Cicero, but then later with the Christian period, saying, look, you have to have rules, you have to have restraint, because remember, a lot of this St. Augustine is talking about is in fact an extension of the concept of a legitimate civil authority in government. St. Paul says in Romans 13 that the magistrate does not bear the sword in vain. which the Greek word for bearing the sword means the capacity to execute somebody. That is, if they begin to murder people and do evil and violent things. So if we believe in the concept of the police power, that is, the police can go somewhere and they can, or the whatever authority is representing the civil authority, the police or whatever, and they can physically restrain or, if necessary, kill somebody who's trying to murder another person. If we admit that that's acceptable, then you have to, at least in theory, admit that that can be extended to defending the country, defending the larger community, civil community. So I would say that by the very fact that, look at the Byzantine Empire and the Russian Empire, the Serbian Empire, Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, etc., they did wage wars, and we may argue that they may have not always had the best reasons, but they certainly, in theory, accepted that what they were doing was just. Very, very few rulers ever say, I know my war is unjust and I'm going to still do it, because it delegitimizes you. But still, St. Basil and other fathers do, in fact, have St. Athanasius has a canon about this, where St. Athanasius, for example, says that that our fathers, our holy fathers, did not count killing in warfare between soldiers, combatants, to be murder, to be unjust killing.
Well, I think that's actually, if you look in the City of God, that's actually St. Augustine's position as well. Basically, in the passage you quoted, he effectively says that that is the one exception to considering it murder, and he goes as far back as Abraham to say that. So, now in the City of God, basically, one thing that he does point out is he talks a lot about historical wars that had taken place, and he puts them in a rather ugly context. And what he's basically saying is that if these wars, which we know were this bloody, could be considered still to some degree, could be considered acceptable wars, then the society in which we live, and this is where it ties into, if it is corrupt, and if it is, horrific, as he points out with, he was pointing out, in the Second Punic War. But the point is that he's saying simply that we're so far removed from even proper behavior in war. Now, granted, people will say again, and this is why I brought up the Geneva Conventions, that we're not supposed to do certain things. Do we not do them anyway? To some degree, we do, and it's a bit of a problem. War is, to some degree, we live in an age where I think that in a lot of countries, the concept of war becomes more academic than it becomes real, and we seem to forget that a lot of the world currently is at war, and so we have to look at our behavior with it.
And now remember, St. Basil in his canon, Canon 13 of St. Basil, says, our fathers did not consider the killings committed in the course of wars to be classifiable as murders at all, on the score, it seems to me, of allowing a pardon to men fighting in defense of sobriety and piety. Perhaps, though, it might be advisable to refuse them communion for 3 years on the grounds that they are not clean-handed. Now, this is important because St. Basil is saying that, yes, you can have wars fighting in defense of sobriety and piety. If someone invades your province, and they're going to basically, attack your city and kill everybody in it, the patristic answer, as far as I can understand, is acceptable for the civilian authorities to say, look, we have to raise a militia, we have to keep people from killing, everybody in the city. It's just going to have to be done. But St. Basil says it's advisable, he doesn't say you have to do it, but it's advisable to refuse communion for 3 years on the ground that they're not clean-handed. And one of the reasons is that ancient wars, like even modern wars, are very dirty. Let's say, for example, you are laying siege to an enemy encampment in the ancient period, and you fire a catapult, and guess what? The catapult lands, and it kills the enemy soldiers, but let's say they had some prisoners there who were, slaves who had nothing to do with it, and they die. Or you go into an enemy encampment, and you start killing people, and you kill people who may entirely be trying to surrender, but in the heat of the battle, you kill people who are trying to surrender, all right? So the fathers still realize that even soldiers fighting in defense of sobriety and piety, the act of you fighting still did affect some sort of ulceration in your personality, I'd say, or had some sort of effect on you. And of course, there's the letter of Saint Athanasius to Amun, who I believe was a monastic, in which Saint Athanasius basically adopts the exact same position. And that just, seems to, not be much. Now, technically, bishops, priests, and deacons, for example, Canon 83 of the Holy Apostles says clergy cannot be engaged in military matters,
right?
And cannot hold. And so you're really, this is one of the things people forget. If you're a cleric, you can't really own a gun. Even if
all those pictures that you see, like I've seen all these pictures of MP priests with guns. That's really not right.
I mean, it's one thing for soldiers and private people to have weapons, as the nation regulates and allows. It's quite, I mean, technically, if a cleric, if someone, and this is part of the problem, if I'm a hieromonk, if someone tries to kill me, if I fight in defense of myself and I end up killing them, I lose the priesthood. And I'm not going to complain about that. Ultimately, the clergy have a higher standard, and, they're meant to die to a certain extent just for.
Well, you're like that. There was the priest mace. So that.
Oh yeah, exactly. Well, the concept was that they were saying, well, clergy can't shed blood. They were taking it very literally, and they're like, well, we're not shedding blood if we're just smashing you in the back and breaking your bones. I guess
with a blunt object, exactly.
And but that's a little bit literalistic or legalistic in this interpretation.
I think one or two good shots to the stomach might stop someone. But
as far as I understand, I know there are a lot of pacifist type people. And modernist and things who say that Orthodox do not believe in pacifism. I have never encountered that as a principle that's been forced upon the civilian population and by the fathers.
No.
And they've never. They will try to point to the fact that Saint Ambrose had this great conflict with the Emperor Saint Theodosius, and did not allow. For example, what happened was that there was a riot in Thessalonica, as I recall, like in the 380s or 390s. And in the riot, the rioters ended up attacking one of the imperial offices, and they killed everybody in it. They basically massacred a bunch of people. It was over some tax situation or a bread riot or something like that. And the imperial government basically sent the army in, and the army was going to restore order. Well, things got out of control, as it invariably did, and the army ended up killing like 5,000 people in Thessalonica, trying to restore order. And it was considered, this great kind of catastrophe. And everybody kind of admitted that what the army did and how the government reacted, they shouldn't, was wrong. And so St. Ambrose basically said that the emperor, by sending the army in and knowing better, he can't come into the church unless, he actually said the emperor can't sit in the presbytery. Because technically the emperor was allowed to sit in the presbytery, like almost where the priest sat, in the apse. And St. Ambrose told the Emperor St. Theodosius when he came to Milan, he said, look, because this has happened and you were responsible for how your soldiers behaved, even though they were trying to restore order, and I understand that, you yourself have to do penance. And the Emperor Theodosius was very upset, but he eventually did do penance. And he was never allowed to sit in the presbytery in Milan again. I think he may have done it in Constantinople anyway. But that's an example that St. Ambrose did not condemn him for the fact that he had to restore order. It's the fact that, if there's a riot, it doesn't give the police carte blanche just go machine gunning people down.
Yeah.
And a lot of times people are like, oh, law and order. And yes, that's true. You need law and order. But even if the rioters have killed people, if the killing has stopped, just dragging people out of their houses and doing summary executions is probably not going to help restore order and relations in that city in the long run. You may just need legitimate trials to deal with those things.
Exactly.
That's just my opinion.
I don't see any more questions, and we're in the last 2 minutes. So
I think we made a lot of people angry with some of the stuff we were talking about.
That's okay. Look, we're going to be honest. Some of the answers, people are not going to like them, and that's okay. And the whole point is we're looking to open discussion. People have opinions, and people want to know, and people want to understand how this relates to apologetics. This is a little different than the regular apologetics channel, but I want to steer away from, maybe, I don't know if we need another show for jurisdiction. No, we don't need another show. We have enough.
No, we don't need another show.
We have like 3 shows now, so I think it's enough. But just keep asking questions. Even if sometimes you don't like the answers, tell us. We'll have a discussion.
Yeah, give us some pushback. Right? Say, well, I disagree on these grounds here.
And it's perfectly okay. That's the learning process, and it's something if you can't argue with two Orthodox guys. I mean, what's your chances against a Jehovah's Witness? I mean, the point is, you got to be free to speak.
Well, I don't know. Some of those Jehovah's Witnesses, do they really know all the?
No, they're really, really easy once you get to deal with them. As soon as you offer them water, if they're scared of taking a cup of water from you, they're probably already afraid because they know you're on the offensive.
How about the Mormon missionaries? How are they?
The Mormon missionaries are almost always kids. They learn a basic set of things, and then if you answer the basic set of things, they get really confused. But then you can kind of lead them along and tell them about Orthodox vestments and priesthood and fun things like that. They get really fascinated by it. But usually then the stake missionary will write off your address and they'll never come to your house again.
Yeah, that happened to me a few times.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it happens to me all the time.
When I was younger, I used to say, "Oh, come on in," and have debates with them and things.
You can do that with Mormons, but now certain groups of Jehovah's Witnesses are taught like the icons have demons in them. So I always have like icons around when I invite in Jehovah's Witnesses, and I watch their reaction because a lot of the time, if they see the icons, they'll be like, "Oh, we got to go."
Our father Brendan, like 30 years ago, when he was living in Georgia, there was a Jehovah's Witness that knocked on the door. And he was like, "Okay, let me greet him." And this, I don't know, you may not agree with what he did, but as soon as he opened the door, he had his hand cross, his priestly hand cross, and he says, "I greet you in the name of our Lord God and Savior Jesus Christ." And he, made the sign of the cross with the hand cross, and they got terrified and they turned around and they ran off. Yeah. So his interpretation was that it was the demonic activity. Now I've seen there was one case in which I was with a bishop one time. And I was coming out from a train station, and there were these Brazilian Pentecostals, speaking Portuguese and things, but they spoke English too. I don't know. It was very strange. Brazilian Pentecostals out of nowhere, like they were harassing me because I was just waiting at the train station to get picked up, and I was debating them. I had my Gideon New Testament, and they were confused that supposedly, because I guess they were like the Orthodox or like the Roman Catholics. They don't know the Bible, and they're confused with the fact that I knew the Bible. And so the bishop came up because he was supposed to pick me up, and he had his Panagio on, and one of them turned around and he foamed at the mouth, and he pointed and said, "Now, Maria," N-A-O, which is how I guess in Portuguese they say no.
Right.
And he backed away in his eyes, and he started shaking, and they just all left. So to me, I interpreted that as demonic activity.
That's very possible because the Pentecostal movement is all based upon calling in spirits.
Exactly.
So
and of course, the image of the Virgin with our Lord, that represents the ultimate, one of the defeats of the devil, the incarnation. Yeah. And so they did not like that. Even though they had been willing to discuss things with me, as soon as they saw the Panagia, they became terrified, and
maybe not the ones that didn't were still obviously not under demonic assault.
Well, that one guy,
he needs an exorcism.
Yeah.
But anyway,
okay.
We're done for this time. We keep in mind on Saturday there is the Western Orthodox. We're doing the Western Orthodox show. I will only be on for probably half the show, and Father Enoch can answer all your questions about Orthodoxy and the Western Rite, the Western Fathers, so on and so forth.
So let's make it clear. The show on Tuesday is about Orthodox apologetics explicitly, dealing with debates with non-Orthodox and such.
Right.
This show is Orthodoxy versus everything else.
Yeah, basically what the stance.
You can bring up issues about, political issues, economic issues, the nationalism issue. Well, how do these things relate to Orthodoxy? Supposedly if issues about science and things like that. I think that's important too. And then the third show we do on Saturday is basically about Western Rite Orthodoxy. Mm-hmm. So we try to keep, this is kind of a catch-all show, but anything that doesn't fit into the category of Orthodox apologetics and Western Rite Orthodoxy can be asked here.
All right. Well, in that case, we'll say thank you to everyone for your questions, comments, for listening, and we're gonna say goodnight. Benedicite.
Okay, benedicite.